Look around at your neighborhood, at your city, at the places where you grew up. Something fundamental has changed, hasn't it? The houses that middle-class families used to buy are now investment properties owned by corporations. The jobs that once provided a comfortable life now barely cover rent. The economic ladder that previous generations climbed is being pulled up rung by rung, and millions of people are starting to wonder if we're witnessing the death of something essential to modern society. For decades, the middle class was the beating heart of Western democracies. It was the buffer between the wealthy and the poor, the engine of consumer spending, the foundation of stable societies. But that foundation is cracking, and what's emerging in its place looks disturbingly familiar to anyone who's studied history. We're seeing patterns that echo a time when society was divided into a small group of landowners and a vast population of people who worked their land, a time we call feudalism. In 1971, 61% of American households were middle class. By 2021, that number had dropped to 50%. For the first time in modern history, the middle class is no longer the majority. In Canada, the United Kingdom, and across much of Europe, similar trends are playing out. The middle is hollowing out, and people are falling through the cracks. But it's not just about percentages. Traditionally, being middle class meant you could own a home, save for retirement, send your kids to college, and handle an unexpected expense without financial catastrophe. It meant security and upward mobility. It meant that if you worked hard and played by the rules, you could build a better life for yourself and your children. That promise is breaking down. Home ownership, once the cornerstone of middle-class wealth, is becoming increasingly unreachable. In cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Sydney, London, and San Francisco, the average home costs 10, 12, sometimes 15 times the median annual income. A generation ago, it was 3 to 4 times. Young people today are facing a housing market that their parents and grandparents would find incomprehensible. And here's where the feudalism comparison starts to make uncomfortable sense. In medieval feudalism, a small aristocratic class owned the land, and everyone else paid them to live on it. The peasants could work the land, but they would never own it. Their labor enriched the landowners generation after generation. Now fast forward to today. Massive investment firms, private equity companies, and wealthy individuals are buying up residential properties at an unprecedented scale. BlackRock, one of the world's largest asset managers, made headlines for purchasing entire neighborhoods of single-family homes. These entities aren't buying homes to live in them. They're buying them as assets that generate steady rental income. They can outbid individual families because they have access to cheap credit, they can make all-cash offers, and they can wait out market fluctuations. For them, housing isn't about having a place to live, it's about returns on investment. And for everyone else, this means competing against entities with vastly more resources. Entities that are essentially recreating a landlord class on a scale we haven't seen in centuries. The result? More and more people are becoming permanent renters. They're paying monthly rent that often exceeds what a mortgage would cost, but they're building no equity, accumulating no wealth, gaining no stake in the system. This isn't the temporary renting of youth anymore. This is people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who have given up on ever owning a home. This is families raising children without the stability and wealth building that homeownership provides. But the neo-feudalism emerging today goes beyond just housing. The nature of employment has fundamentally transformed. The stable full-time jobs with benefits, pensions, and job security that built the middle class are disappearing. They're being replaced by contract work, gig economy jobs, and precarious employment. You're not a worker anymore. You're an independent contractor, a partner, a freelancer. These terms sound empowering, but in reality, they often mean you have no benefits, no job security, no paid time off, and no retirement plan. Companies like Uber, DoorDash, and TaskRabbit have built billion-dollar valuations on the backs of workers who assume all the risk while the platforms extract the profit. You provide the car, the gas, the insurance, the labor, and you take on all the liability. The platform takes a cut of every transaction. You're essentially a peasant, farming land you don't own, giving a portion of your harvest to the lord of the manor. Union membership has collapsed across the developed world. In the United States, it's fallen from 35% of workers in the 1950s to just 10% today. Unions were the mechanism that allowed workers to collectively bargain for better wages and benefits. Without them, the balance of power has shifted dramatically toward employers. Wages have stagnated, while productivity and corporate profits have soared. And let's talk about that wealth concentration, because the numbers are staggering. The richest 1% of the global population now owns more wealth than the bottom 95% combined. In the United States, 3 individuals owned more wealth than the bottom 50% of the American population, that's 160 million people, combined. This level of wealth concentration is comparable to the Gilded Age and, yes, to feudal societies. But there's a crucial difference between today's wealthy elite and the middle-class success stories of previous generations. Today's billionaires aren't just rich, they're operating at a scale that gives them power rivaling nation-states. They own the platforms where we communicate, the algorithms that shape what we see, the infrastructure of modern life. Amazon controls a massive portion of online commerce and cloud computing. Google controls information access. Facebook controls social connection. These aren't just companies, they're digital fiefdoms, and we're all living in them, subject to their rules, their algorithms, their decisions. And here's what's particularly insidious. Unlike the feudal lords of the past, who were obviously lords, today's elite are presented as innovators, as self-made billionaires who earned their position through genius and hard work. There's a mythology that anyone can join their ranks if you just work hard enough. But this mythology obscures the reality that these individuals benefit from enormous structural advantages. The game is rigged, but we're told it's a meritocracy. Education, which used to be the great equalizer, is now another mechanism of class entrenchment. College costs have increased by over 250% in the last 30 years, far outpacing inflation and wage growth. Students are graduating with crushing debt, often $50,000, $100,000, even $200,000 or more. And this debt is largely non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. It follows you for life, garnishing your wages, limiting your options. This creates a new form of indentured servitude. You need the degree to access decent-paying jobs, but getting the degree puts you in debt that limits your freedom for decades. You can't take risks. You can't start a business. You have to service the debt. Meanwhile, the children of the wealthy graduate debt-free, often with family connections that open doors, with safety nets that allow them to take risks. The playing field isn't level. It's tilted so steeply that climbing it requires superhuman effort. Healthcare is another arena where neo-feudalism is evident. In countries without universal healthcare, particularly the United States, medical expenses are the leading cause of bankruptcy. People with insurance still face devastating costs if they get seriously ill. You can do everything right, work hard, save money, and then get cancer or have a car accident, and suddenly you're financially destroyed. Even in countries with universal health care, we're seeing slow erosion through underfunding and privatization, creating a tiered system where your health outcomes depend on your wealth. The political system, which is supposed to represent everyone equally, has also been captured by wealth. Studies have shown that the preferences of average citizens have virtually no impact on policy outcomes, while the preferences of economic elites and business interest groups have substantial impact. This isn't democracy. This is oligarchy with democratic window dressing. Politicians depend on wealthy donors to fund their campaigns. They're responsive to those donors, not to voters. And this aristocracy is increasingly hereditary. Social mobility, the ability to rise from a lower economic class to a higher one, is declining. If you're born poor in America today, you're more likely to stay poor than in almost any other developed country. The biggest predictor of your economic success is the wealth of your parents. We're creating a class system where your birth largely determines your destiny, just like in feudal societies. Now, some might argue that this comparison to feudalism is overwrought. After all, we have technology, democracy, human rights, and legal equality. We're not literally serfs bound to the land. And that's true. But the underlying economic structure is becoming increasingly similar. In feudalism, the aristocracy owned the land. Today's elite own the assets of a modern economy: real estate, financial instruments, intellectual property, data, and platforms. In feudalism, peasants worked the land but could never own it. Today, workers labor but increasingly own nothing, paying rent for housing, subscriptions for services, and interest on debt. So what's driving this transformation? The answer involves multiple factors that have reinforced each other over decades. It starts with a fundamental shift in economic policy that began in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The post-war period saw rising wages, strong unions, high taxes on the wealthy, and regulations that constrained corporate power. This was the era that built the middle class. But starting with Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US, there was a dramatic policy shift toward neoliberalism. This ideology prioritizes free markets, deregulation, privatization, and tax cuts for the wealthy. The theory was that prosperity would trickle down to everyone. The reality has been very different. Deregulation allowed corporations to consolidate into monopolies. Tax cuts reduced government revenue, leading to cuts in public services. Unions were actively undermined. Globalization allowed corporations to move production to wherever labor was cheapest. The 2008 financial crisis was a turning point that could have reversed these trends. But what actually happened? The banks that caused the crisis were bailed out with public money. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people lost their homes, their jobs, and their savings. In the recovery, central banks implemented policies that inflated asset prices. If you owned assets, you saw your wealth increase dramatically. If you relied on wages, you saw minimal benefit. The recovery was overwhelmingly captured by the wealthy. This pattern repeated with COVID. During the pandemic, while millions lost jobs and businesses, billionaire wealth increased by over $1 trillion. We're now in a situation where the system seems designed to funnel wealth upward during both crises and recoveries. When times are good, the wealthy capture most of the gains. When times are bad, they get bailed out, while everyone else suffers. Technology, which many believed would democratize opportunity, has largely reinforced these trends. Digital markets are controlled by a few massive platforms that extract rent from everyone else. If you want to sell online, you probably pay Amazon a cut. If you want to advertise, you pay Google or Facebook. These platforms have network effects that make them nearly impossible to compete with. You're not competing in a free market. You're a tenant in their digital fiefdom, paying tribute for the privilege of doing business. The question we face is whether this trajectory is inevitable or whether we can rebuild a genuine middle class and create a more equitable society. History suggests that extreme inequality is neither stable nor sustainable. Every society that has allowed wealth to concentrate to these levels has eventually faced crisis, whether through revolution, reform, or collapse. We're at a crossroads, and the choices we make in the coming years will determine whether we continue sliding toward a new feudalism or whether we can create something better. The systems that created broad-based prosperity in the past didn't emerge naturally. They were fought for, legislated, and built deliberately. Progressive taxation, strong labor protections, antitrust enforcement, investment in public goods like education and infrastructure, these weren't accidents. They were policy choices made by societies that recognized the dangers of concentrated wealth and power. We face similar choices today. We can continue down this path and accept a future where a small elite owns everything while everyone else suffers to survive. Or we can demand fundamental changes to how our economy operates. The future isn't written yet, but the warning signs are everywhere, and the time to act is running out.